The spotlight and the storm. The red on-air sign lit up like a signal flare, glowing above the late-night set of the Spotlight show. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, their eyes fixed on the side stage curtain. They had come for laughter, gossip, and maybe a bit of controversy. It was what the Spotlight show had built its reputation on. Greg Carson, the show's charismatic and sharp-tongued host, adjusted his tie and looked out into the studio audience. A man in his early 50s, Greg was well known for being a provocateur. His interviews weren't conversations. They were battlegrounds. He enjoyed making celebrities squirm, not out of malice, but because it kept ratings high and social media ablaze. Tonight, the stakes were higher than usual. The guest, none other than Keanu Reeves, the beloved, humble Hollywood icon who was trending not for a film, but for a story that had recently gone viral. A week ago, a video of Keanu quietly comforting a crying stranger in a New York subway had surfaced. No paparazzi, no entourage, just Keanu, sitting cross-legged on the subway floor, listening to someone he'd never met. The internet exploded with praise. People called him a saint, a living legend, too good for this world. But not Greg. He smelled a story behind the story, a weakness, perhaps, or at least something he could spin into television gold. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Greg's voice boomed. Please welcome the man who brought Neo to life, the face of John Wick, and the nicest guy in Hollywood, Keanu Reeves. The crowd leaped to their feet, clapping thunderously as Keanu stepped onto the stage. Dressed simply in a black suit and boots, his long hair slightly tousled, Keanu walked with the same quiet confidence that had made him an enigma in an industry obsessed with noise. He smiled at the crowd, waved once, and nodded politely as he sat down across from Greg. "You made it," Greg said, flashing his signature smirk. "Thanks for having me," Keanu replied, his voice calm, measured, sincere. There was a pause, a silence just long enough to feel strange. "So," Greg began, crossing his legs and leaning back, "you've had one heck of a month. Subway hero, charity donations, fans crying over how humble you are. Are you trying to run for Pope or something?" The audience laughed, half-heartedly. Keanu gave a soft chuckle. "I just try to be kind," he said simply. "It doesn't take much." Greg raised an eyebrow. "You know, Keanu, some people think all this humility is just a really smart PR move. The sad Keanu memes, the stories of you giving away millions, makes you look like the last good guy in Hollywood." Keanu didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to look like anything," he said. "I just try to live with purpose." Greg leaned forward. The cameras zoomed in, sensing tension. "Come on, though. No one's that good. Isn't it exhausting? Always being Saint Keanu. Isn't that a mask too?" The room fell quiet. The audience, once eager to laugh, now watched with bated breath. Something felt off. Keanu looked at Greg, truly looked at him. Not with anger, but with something deeper, something steadier. "Can I tell you a story?" he asked. Greg blinked, slightly thrown off. "Sure, we've got time." Keanu shifted in his seat. The studio lights reflected off his eyes, but they didn't dim the quiet gravity behind them. "When I was 23, my best friend died in a car crash," Keanu began, his voice low but unwavering. "A year later, my girlfriend gave birth to our stillborn daughter. And not long after that, she passed away in an accident too." Gasps rippled through the audience. Greg's smile faltered. Keanu continued, undeterred. "For a while, I didn't know how to live. I didn't know why I should live. But I found something in silence, in stillness. I realized that kindness wasn't a weakness, it was survival." He paused. "So when I see someone hurting, even if they're a stranger, I try to show up, because maybe no one else will." The studio was dead silent now. Greg shifted uncomfortably, tapping his pen against his cue cards. Keanu looked out at the audience. "We live in a world where it's easier to be cruel than kind. But every time we choose kindness, we're pushing back against that darkness. Just a little bit. Greg cleared his throat. Well, that's heavy. Keanu smiled gently. Life is heavy sometimes. A lone clap echoed from the back of the room. Then another. Soon, the audience erupted in applause, not the polite kind reserved for celebrity interviews, but a genuine, rising thunder of appreciation. Greg tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. All right. Let's talk about John Wick 5. But the audience wasn't listening. They were on their feet. Something had shifted. Backstage, the fallout begins. As the show wrapped up, Greg retreated to his dressing room, fuming. He'd been planning to corner Keanu, to catch him off guard, and maybe go viral for breaking down the nice guy facade. Instead, Keanu had flipped the script, not by fighting back, but by telling the truth. His vulnerability had stolen the spotlight. Twitter was already exploding. Clips from the show were spreading like wildfire. Greg looked at his reflection in the mirror, angry, not just because his plan had backfired, but because, deep down, he wasn't sure he could have responded the way Keanu did. Later that night, the subway ride. Keanu rode home alone, taking the subway like he often did. No limo, no driver, just a man among people. An older woman sitting beside him leaned over. "I saw you tonight," she said softly. "You spoke beautifully." Keanu nodded, offering the small smile. "Thank you." She hesitated. "You reminded me of my son. He passed last year. He always said, 'Be kind, even when no one's watching.'" Keanu gently reached for her hand. "He sounds like a beautiful soul." Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "So do you." Meanwhile, social media reacts. By morning, hashtags like #KeanuKindness, #GregCarsonCancelled, and #RealHero were trending worldwide. The public wasn't just praising Keanu for his movies anymore. They were honoring him for being human in a world starving for empathy. A tweet with millions of likes read, "Greg tried to expose Keanu." Instead, Keanu exposed what it means to be truly strong. Behind the curtain, the weight of silence. The next morning, Greg Carson sat in his luxurious penthouse apartment, scrolling through his phone with trembling fingers. His usual smirk was gone. The glare of the screen reflected the trending hashtags he could no longer avoid. #Keanu Reeves Strength, #Kindness is Strength, #Greg Carson Disrespectful, #Humanity Matters. It was supposed to be just another show, another night of entertainment and singers. Instead, it had become a cultural moment. Keanu's calm, honest words had cut through the noise like a blade through fog, and in doing so, revealed something about Greg that people didn't like. The clips were everywhere. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube Shorts. Fans weren't just reposting the moment. They were defending it like a sacred truth. He didn't fight back. He didn't mock. He told his story, and it shut the world up. That's power. At SoulWriter92, "This is the kind of man I want my son to become. Thank you, Keanu." At MOMF2Heroes, even journalists were picking up the story. One op-ed from a leading entertainment site read, "Greg Carson tried to bait Keanu Reeves. Instead, Reeves handed him a lesson in dignity, humility, and strength the world desperately needed." Greg let out a frustrated sigh. Unbelievable. He tossed his phone onto the couch and walked toward the window. Outside, the city moved on, cars honking, people rushing, life continuing. But something inside Greg had shifted. Something unsettling. It wasn't just the backlash or the headlines. It was the mirror Keanu had held up to him. For the first time in years, Greg was seeing himself clearly, and he didn't like what he saw. Meanwhile, Keanu's quiet morning. Far away from the noise, Keanu Reeves sat on the edge of his small backyard garden. He was alone, save for a scruffy rescue dog named Harvey, who followed him everywhere like a shadow with 4 legs. Harvey wasn't much to look at, part terrier, part mystery, but his loyalty was fierce. Keanu had rescued him from a freeway 2 years ago after watching a dozen cars swerve to avoid him. Now, they were inseparable. Keanu gently scratched Harvey's ears, his mind still on last night's interview. He wasn't angry. He didn't feel victorious. He felt sad. Not for himself, but for Greg. I saw it in his eyes, Keanu murmured aloud. The pain. Harvey whimpered softly, as if understanding. It was always easier to lash out than to open up. Greg had built a career on cutting people down because it made him feel taller. But last night, Keanu had looked past the performance and seen a man at war with himself. Flashback. The quiet before the storm. What the cameras didn't catch was what happened before the show. Keanu had arrived early, as always. He was polite to everyone, from the interns to the janitors. While sipping herbal tea in the green room, he noticed a young stagehand struggling to carry a lighting rig. Without hesitation, Keanu stood up and helped him carry it across the hallway. "You don't have to do that, sir," the stagehand stuttered. Keanu smiled. "If I see someone carrying something heavy, I help. That's the rule, right?" The stagehand would later post that story on Reddit. It went viral. But Keanu didn't do it for attention. He just did it. Greg's breakdown behind the scenes. Back at the Spotlight studio, the crew was uneasy. Greg was pacing his office like a caged animal. He had never faced this kind of public heat before. Sponsors were calling. Advertisers were questioning. Viewers were unsubscribing from the show's YouTube channel by the thousands. His assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." "Unless it's my career's resurrection, I'm not interested," Greg snapped. "It's Keanu Reeves." Greg froze. The unexpected visit. Keanu walked in quietly, hands in his pockets, wearing a hoodie and jeans. No entourage. No press. Just him. Greg stood awkwardly. You lost or something?" Keanu smiled faintly. "No. I figured you might need a cup of coffee." He held out 2 cups. Greg took one, confused. "Why are you here?" Greg asked after a long pause. Keanu sat on the armrest of the couch, casual, unbothered. "Because I know what it feels like to have the world turn on you. And because I don't think you're a bad person. Just hurt." Greg scoffed. "You don't know anything about me." "I know hurt when I see it," Keanu said softly. "And I know how easy it is to build armor instead of healing." Silence. Greg looked down. For the first time in years, the sarcastic words didn't come. He felt like a child caught in the act, not because Keanu was angry, but because he wasn't. There was no judgment in his voice, just compassion. And that made it worse somehow. "You should hate me," Greg mumbled. "I don't hate people," Keanu said. "I just try to understand them." The unexpected offer. Keanu stood to leave but paused at the door. "I'm hosting a charity event this weekend. For animal shelters and underprivileged kids. You should come." Greg blinked. "Me? After what I did to you?" Keanu nodded. "Maybe that's exactly why." Later that week, the redemption begins. The event was called Hearts Without Armor. It was held at a local park. No red carpets, no press walls. Just food trucks, dog adoption booths, a stage for acoustic performances, and a donation station for books and toys. Keanu mingled with guests, knelt beside children, hugged volunteers. And Greg. He stood awkwardly near the back, unsure why he even came. Then he saw Keanu kneel beside a young girl in a wheelchair. She had a rescued pit bull in her lap and tears in her eyes. "My last dog died last year," she whispered. "I didn't think I'd ever be happy again." Keanu put a hand over hers. "This one looks like she's going to give you double the love." Greg watched as the girl smiled. Really smiled for the first time that day. It hit him like a punch to the chest. This was real. No cameras, no applause, just humanity. He turned and walked away, because suddenly he couldn't watch. not without feeling broken. The mirror of regret. That night, Greg sat in his apartment, staring at a blank Word document. He had opened it to write an apology, a public statement. But what could he say? How do you explain to the world that you realized you've spent your whole life being the villain in other people's stories? Then, without thinking, he opened a new browser tab and searched, "How to forgive yourself for the damage you've done." Meanwhile, Keanu reflects. Back in his modest home, Keanu sat in his reading chair beside Harvey. He picked up an old, worn journal and began to write. March 22nd. Greg is not a bad man, just a hurting one. I've learned that some of the cruelest people are just trying to protect the softest parts of themselves. If I can help him find that part again, maybe the world will gain another voice for kindness. He closed the journal and smiled. Right, Harvey. The dog wagged his tail. The weight of words, a public reckoning. It had been 4 days since the now infamous talk show interview aired, and Greg Carson had barely left his apartment. Outside his window, the city moved with its usual indifferent energy, cars honking, people walking with purpose, neon signs blinking like heartbeats. But inside his penthouse, everything was still, stiflingly still. Greg stood before a full-length mirror, studying himself, not his clothes, not his gray-flecked hair or designer watch. No, he was trying to see something beneath all that, something he'd lost. His reputation, maybe. His pride, probably. But mostly, it was something more fragile. His soul. He was a man who made a living by tearing into others. He'd once been praised for it. A ruthless interviewer, the man with the sharpest tongue in television. For years, the industry had rewarded his cruelty. But now, after one interview with a man who refused to fight back, everything had changed. The message that started it all. At 6:43 a.m., Greg opened his inbox. Amid thousands of angry emails and PR demands, one message stood out. The subject line was simple. "Thank you for letting the world see the real Keanu." It was from a mother in Ohio. She described how her teenage son had been struggling with depression for 2 years. The night of the interview, they watched Keanu speak about grief and survival. The next morning, her son got out of bed and asked for help. "I don't know if you meant for any of it to happen," she wrote, "but thank you for airing it. My son is alive today because of that moment." Greg stared at the screen. His eyes blurred with tears. It hit him all at once. He hadn't just insulted a celebrity. He nearly tried to destroy a lifeline for someone else. And Keanu had responded not with vengeance, but with grace. Greg closed his laptop. And for the first time in his 25-year career, he knew what he had to do. The video. An open letter to the world. That afternoon, Greg called his production assistant. "I want to film something," he said. "No audience, no edits, no teleprompter." Just 40 minutes later, Greg stood alone in front of the same backdrop from the interview stage, but the lights were dimmed, and the tone was nothing like before. No theme music, no fanfare, just him, the camera, and the truth. He looked into the lens like it was a mirror. "Hi, my name is Greg Carson." Deep breath. "Last week, I interviewed Keanu Reeves. I went in with the wrong intentions. I wanted to provoke. I wanted ratings. And I was cruel." A pause. But Keanu didn't fight back. He didn't insult me. He told the truth. He spoke about pain, grief, and kindness. And instead of making him look weak, it made me realize how small I'd become. Greg looked down, his voice shaking. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to earn back my humanity. Starting now." He stepped aside, and a slideshow began. Images from Keanu's charity event, including the little girl in the wheelchair holding her new dog. Greg's voice continued in a narration. "There are people in this world who carry the weight of loss and still find the strength to be kind. Keanu is one of them. I want to learn how to be one too." The video ended with text. "Be kind. Even when it's hard. Inspired by Keanu Reeves. The internet reacts. Again. Within 12 hours, the video had 10 million views. This time, the comments were different. This is what accountability looks like. Well done, Greg. At Healing Hearts, we forgive not because people deserve it, but because the world needs healing. I believe in you. Kindness is contagious. Still not a fan of how you treated Keanu. But T.S. This is growth. At Real Tom Now, even the hashtags shifted. Hashtag redemption in progress. Hashtag Keanu's impact. Hashtag Greg apologizes. People were talking, not just about Keanu or Greg, but about forgiveness, grief, mental health, and humanity. And quietly, in the background of all of it, Keanu watched. Keanu's reaction. A letter of his own. Keanu didn't reply with a video. He didn't go live on Instagram or call a press conference. He wrote a handwritten letter. It was delivered directly to Greg's apartment by courier the next evening. Greg sat at his kitchen counter, holding the envelope with shaking hands. Inside, the note was written in Keanu's unmistakably neat, careful script. Greg, I saw your video. I believe in second chances. I believe in the courage it takes to face yourself. You reminded me that change is possible, even for those who think they're too far gone. I'm proud of you. There's a dog rescue in Nevada that's struggling to stay open. I donated yesterday. I thought maybe you'd like to match it. It's called Second Leash on Life. Sincerely, Keanu. Tears welled in Greg's eyes. He hadn't cried this much since his father passed away 15 years ago. A man he'd never mourned properly because he was too busy chasing headlines. He pulled out his phone and wired $100,000 to the rescue organization. Not for publicity, not for atonement, but because it felt right. A surprise encounter at the shelter. 2 weeks later, Greg flew to Nevada. He told no one, no camera crew, no press, just himself. He arrived at the shelter Keanu had mentioned. Second Leash on Life. It was a modest building, tucked between dry desert roads and wind-worn hills. Inside, the barking of dogs echoed like a chaotic symphony. He was met by the shelter director, a woman in her 60s named Marla. Her smile was tired but warm. "You're Greg Carson, aren't you?" she asked. "You're not what I expected." "Most people say that," he replied. As she showed him around, introducing him to each rescue dog, she added quietly, "You know, Keanu came here last year too." Quiet. No press. Just played with the dogs for hours. Greg smiled. Sounds like him. In the final kennel, a frail golden retriever named Buddy limped toward the fence. He was hit by a car. Been here 6 months. No one wants an old, broken dog. Greg knelt down. Buddy placed a trembling paw against the wire, and for a second, Greg saw himself. Healing begins with one kind act. Later that day, Greg signed the adoption papers. Buddy would have a home. And Greg. He would finally have a reason to come home to something that didn't care about who he had been, only about who he was becoming. A new voice, a new mission. Back in Los Angeles, Greg launched a new web series titled Behind the Armor. Interviews not designed to provoke, but to heal. He sat down with veterans, foster kids, ex-convicts, cancer survivors. He asked one question to each. What helped you keep going? The show wasn't as flashy. It didn't trend like gossip. But those who watched were changed. And every episode ended the same way. Kindness is never weakness. It's the final proof of strength. A quote he credited, every time, to Keanu Reeves. The unspoken wounds, a truth that shakes the world. It had been 3 months since the night that changed everything. The night when Keanu Reeves calmly silenced a talk show host not with rage, but with truth. In those 3 months, Greg Carson transformed from a man scorned by millions to a man cautiously rediscovering himself. Through his new show, Behind the Armor, he had begun inviting people into vulnerable spaces, a grieving mother, a firefighter who lost his leg saving a family, a former gang member who now ran an after-school program. Each interview ended with a signature closing line that had now become iconic. Kindness is never weakness. It's the final proof of strength. And the man who first showed him that truth, Keanu Reeves, had quietly become an unseen thread in all of it. Greg had not seen Keanu since the letter. They exchanged brief emails about dog rescues, charity funds, and book recommendations, but there were no cameras, no reunions, no public scenes. It was as if both men instinctively understood that healing didn't always need to be broadcast. But everything was about to change, again. An invitation that meant more than it seemed. One quiet Thursday afternoon, Greg received an envelope, hand-delivered. No logo, no fancy stationery, just a card inside with neat black lettering. You're invited to a special episode of Conversations That Matter. Live. Global broadcast. One guest. One interviewer. One truth. The world will be watching. And below that, guest, Keanu Reeves. Interviewer, you. Greg froze. His hand shook slightly as he reread the lines. Not because of the magnitude of the platform. He'd been in front of cameras his entire life. But because of the weight of this moment. This wouldn't be like before. This wouldn't be scripted or confrontational. This would be real. The world waits. The show, hosted annually as a global broadcast aimed at deep, meaningful conversations, had never featured a celebrity before. Politicians, philosophers, human rights activists, yes, but never an actor. But Keanu wasn't coming as an actor. He was coming as a man with something bigger to share. The announcement hit social media like a lightning bolt. Keanu to speak live for Global Mental Health Awareness Month, interviewed by the very man who tried to humiliate him months ago. The internet held its collective breath. The broadcast would be live. No editing, no filters, just truth. The day of the interview. It was held in a minimalist studio. No audience, just white walls and 2 chairs in the center. Greg arrived early, dressed in a black suit, no tie. His heart pounded harder than it had on the night of the original interview. This time, the wait wasn't about being in control. It was about being worthy of the moment. At exactly 7:00 p.m., the door opened. Keanu walked in. Simple dark jeans, gray shirt, and a soft jacket. He smiled when he saw Greg. "Hey," Keanu said softly. Greg stood. "Hey." They shook hands. Firm, respectful, no pretense. The cameras began to roll. Live broadcast begins. The screen faded from black to the soft-lit studio. The world tuned in, millions of people, across time zones, cultures, and languages. Greg took a deep breath. "Keanu, thank you for being here." "Thanks for having me," Keanu said, calm as always. Greg looked into the camera, then back at Keanu. "I want to begin with something simple. Why now? Why this interview?" Keanu paused thoughtfully. "Because I've carried something for a long time. A story I've never told publicly. And I think, maybe it's time." Greg nodded, gently. "We're ready." Keanu's secret, the story of Sam. Keanu looked down at his hands, then met the camera with quiet intensity. "When I was a teenager, I had a best friend named Sam. He was like a brother. Funny, reckless, brave. He taught me how to ride a motorcycle, how to skip school without getting caught, how to cry without shame." Keanu's voice softened. "When I started acting, I drifted away. Not because I wanted to, but because the world pulls you in strange directions. He never held it against me. Not once. He'd always say, 'You're gonna be a big star, but don't forget your roots.' Reeve." Keanu swallowed hard. 2 years into my rise, Sam took his own life. A collective gasp echoed across millions of living rooms. I found out through a voicemail. I didn't even know he was struggling. He never said a word. And for years, decades, I blamed myself. for not calling, for being too busy, for not seeing the signs. Tears welled in Greg's eyes. Keanu continued, voice steady but cracked. That's why I speak the way I do, why I care the way I do. Because every act of kindness I offer is a conversation I never got to have with Sam. The power of silence. The studio fell into a deep, sacred silence. Not awkward, not heavy, just honest. Greg finally spoke. You've spent your life carrying invisible grief and turning it into light for others. Keanu nodded slowly, trying to. I think we all have stories like Sam. Some part of our lives we keep tucked away because we're afraid people won't understand. He turned to the camera. But hiding pain doesn't heal it. Speaking it does. Sharing it lets someone else know they're not alone. Greg's unexpected confession. Greg inhaled deeply. I have a Sam too, he said. Keanu looked at him. Her name was Ava. My sister. She died of an overdose. I blamed her for years. Said she was weak. That she should have fought harder. Greg's eyes flooded. But the truth is, I never fought for her. I never listened. I was too busy building a career. Building walls. Keanu didn't say a word. He just reached over and placed his hand on Greg's. That moment, that touch, was captured in still images and clips that would go on to become symbolic of forgiveness and healing worldwide. The interview ends, but the story doesn't. The closing words of the interview came not from Greg, but from Keanu. He looked into the lens, voice like a heartbeat. If you're watching this, and you feel like no one sees you, please know that someone does. Someone will. Be kind to yourself. The world has enough cruelty. You don't have to carry it alone. The camera faded to black. No outro music, no applause. Just silence. And then, the world wept. Global impact. In the 48 hours following the broadcast, mental health helpline calls increased by 230%. Over $9 million was raised for suicide prevention organizations. The hashtag #TellYourSam trended globally, inviting people to share stories they'd kept buried for years. But most remarkably, people across the world said the same thing in thousands of tweets and posts. I feel less alone. Later that night, alone, but not lonely, Keanu returned home. Harvey curled up beside him on the couch. The world buzzed with reactions, but he didn't check his phone. He opened a notebook and wrote just one line. You're still with me, Sam. In every story I help someone tell. Then he closed the book, leaned back, and exhaled. Not relief, not triumph, but peace. Echoes from the past. A letter that changed everything. The global broadcast had ended, but its echoes still rippled through the hearts of millions. In quiet corners of the world, small towns, city apartments, hospital waiting rooms, and dormitories, people replayed Keanu Reeves' voice, holding on to the words as if they were lifelines. If you're watching this, and you feel like no one sees you, please know that someone does. For many, it wasn't just a message. It was a mirror. For Keanu, however, life returned, at least on the outside, to a quiet routine. Morning coffee, evening walks with Harvey. Reading, writing, reflecting. But he felt it. The shift. There was an undeniable sense that something unfinished had been set in motion, something that needed to be faced. And it arrived, as fate often does, in the form of a letter. The envelope with no return address. It was a cloudy morning when the envelope arrived. Keanu had just stepped out to feed Harvey when he noticed it lying on his doorstep. Cream-colored, no return address, his name written in careful, cursive handwriting. Mr. Keanu Reeves. Private. For your eyes only. He turned it over. No seal, just a simple fold. He opened it slowly. Inside, the handwriting was the same, neat but trembling, like someone holding back emotion with every word. Dear Mr. Reeves, you don't know me, but I knew Sam. We were both part of a volunteer group that helped teens struggling with addiction in Portland. He was one of us before he left. I watched your interview. I never knew how much you loved him. He talked about you, constantly. Called you his brother in Stardust. He used to say, Keanu doesn't know it yet, but he's already saving people. I think if you had known how much he admired you, you might have forgiven yourself sooner. I kept one of his journals. It has something I think you should see. I run a small community center in Ash Hollow, a tiny town in northern Oregon. If you ever feel ready, it's here. With hope. Clara Mendez. Keanu read it again and again. He closed his eyes and whispered, Ash Hollow. It was a name he hadn't heard in over 2 decades. A town forgotten. A journey begins. Ash Hollow was the kind of place people passed through and never remembered. A small rural town dotted with rusted silos, hand-painted signs, and dusty memories. It had one diner, one school, and a post office that still used handwritten forms. Keanu hadn't been there since he and Sam went on a motorcycle trip at 19, reckless and free, with barely enough money for gas and burgers. He remembered the road curving past the cliffs, the wind in their hair, the laughter, the talks about dreams they were too young to realize were fragile. Now, Keanu packed a small overnight bag, left Harvey with a trusted friend, and quietly slipped away. No press, no agents, just purpose. The arrival at Ash Hollow. It was raining when he arrived. The kind of gentle, whispering rain that feels like a memory being washed clean. Keanu parked his car outside the Ash Hollow Community Center, a modest brick building with flower beds struggling against the late spring chill. A mural painted on the sidewall showed children of all races, a tree of life, and a banner that read, You matter more than you know. Inside, the space was filled with warmth. Worn couches, children's art on the walls, a scent of lavender and old wood. And there she was, Clara Mendez, a woman in her late 50s, with long silver-streaked hair tied back, and eyes that had clearly seen pain and peace. She stood up slowly. You came. Keanu nodded. I had to. They embraced, not as strangers, but as people bound by a shared grief. The journal. Clara led him to a small, private room. On the table sat a single leather-bound notebook. Sam left it with me, she said softly. He wanted someone to remember him fully. Not just the mistakes, but the hope too. Keanu sat down and opened it. Inside were pages filled with Sam's handwriting, scribbled poems, sketches of motorcycles, dream lists, and journal entries that hit like quiet explosions. One read, Keanu would laugh if he saw me now. Cleaning up after kids, teaching them to stay clean, telling them they matter. But if he ever reads this, bro, I love you. You saved me more than once. Even if I didn't make it, you gave me something real. If you ever come here, I hope you'll forgive yourself. Keanu couldn't hold back. He wept. The kind of weeping that cleanses the soul, not loud or violent, but steady, like rain returning to earth. Clara placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. He never blamed you. Keanu whispered, I did. Greg's Crossroads, an unexpected offer. Back in Los Angeles, Greg Carson was facing the choice of his own. He had received a call from a major network executive offering him the chance to return to national television. Not just any show, a primetime series with full creative control. You can bring Behind the Armor to millions, the exec said. This is the comeback of a lifetime. Greg stared at the proposal. It was everything he had once dreamed of. But now, he hesitated, because fame had once been his drug, his escape, his armor. And he wasn't sure if this opportunity was a reward or a test. That night, he pulled out the letter Keanu had written, the one that ended with, Change is real and rare, but you've already started. He closed the proposal file and called his assistant. Tell them no, at least, not yet. A town hall. A moment of truth. Back in Ash Hollow, Clara invited Keanu to speak at the community's monthly town hall. Nothing fancy, just folding chairs, homemade lemonade, and neighbors gathering to check in. At first, Keanu declined. "I'm not here to speak," he said. "I'm here to listen." But that night, he sat quietly in the back row, surrounded by families, teens, veterans, and single mothers. People with no Hollywood dreams, no red carpets, just real battles. And when Clara introduced him, the room fell silent. Keanu stood slowly. "I'm not here as an actor," he said. "I'm here as someone who lost a friend, and who carried guilt for too long." He spoke for 5 minutes. No script, just heart. And when he finished, something unexpected happened. A young girl stood up, barely 16, pale with trembling hands. "I tried to not be here anymore," she said softly, "2 weeks ago. But then I saw your interview, and it made me think maybe I don't have to carry everything alone." She walked up to Keanu and hugged him. The room broke into tears and applause. But it wasn't a celebrity moment. It was a human one. The wall of light. Later that evening, Clara showed Keanu a project they had been working on, a long hallway inside the center covered with small framed photos of people who had survived addiction, abuse, self-harm, each one with a name and a quote. At the end of the hallway, a blank space had been reserved. "We wanted to wait," Clara said. She handed Keanu a framed photo, a candid shot of him hugging the girl from the town hall. Beneath it, the quote was simple: "You matter, even when you think you don't." Keanu Reeves. Keanu smiled through tears. "I'm honored," he said. The final pages. That night, in a guest room at the center, Keanu opened Sam's journal again. In the very back, he found a folded note, just one sentence, in bold letters. "If you're reading this, it means you came. I told you, you always show up. I love you, brother." The storm and the seed, when kindness is all that's left. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Los Angeles skyline, streaking the early morning sky with orange and gold, but Keanu Reeves was already awake. He stood barefoot on his small balcony, a cup of tea in its hand, watching the world begin its daily race. But he wasn't rushing. Not anymore. After his journey to Ash Hollow, after reading Sam's journal, after meeting Clara, after holding a trembling girl in his arms and telling her she mattered, something inside Keanu had shifted. For years, he had practiced quiet kindness. Now he was ready to lead with it. He sat down at his kitchen table and began writing. Not a script, not a memoir, but a proposal, something new. Project Sam, a center for silence and support, a place where silence is sacred, where stories are heard, not judged, a home for those carrying invisible grief, a sanctuary named after the friend who taught me that even broken voices deserve to be heard. Keanu Reeves. It would be called Project Sam, a nonprofit wellness and mental health initiative focused on young adults, especially those aging out of the foster system or struggling with depression, addiction, or trauma. It would combine storytelling therapy, rescue dog adoption, mentorship, and grief counseling. Keanu didn't just want to donate anymore. He wanted to build. And in the corner of that first draft, he wrote just one more line. "Greg, if you're reading this, I want you to help me." Meanwhile, Greg's past calls back. While Keanu was planting seeds for the future, Greg Carson was about to confront something he thought he'd buried for good. His phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. But something told him to pick up. "Greg?" said a soft, worn voice. It's me, Derek." Greg's breath caught. Derek was his older brother. They hadn't spoken in 13 years. "Hey," Greg said cautiously. Wow. "Hi. I saw your show, the one with Keanu, and I've been meaning to call for a long time." Greg felt his chest tighten. The silence between them was heavy. You said something in that episode, Derek continued, about blaming people for not fighting hard enough. About Ava. Ava, their sister, the one who died from an overdose. Greg's voice cracked. Yeah, I blamed her too, Derek admitted. But mostly, I blamed you. Because you never came to the funeral. Greg swallowed hard. I couldn't, he whispered. I was too ashamed. There was a long pause. Then Derek said, maybe it's time we stop being ashamed and just be brothers. Greg broke. Tears streamed down his face. I've missed you, man. I missed you too. An invitation that changes everything. The next day, Greg received an email. The subject line was short. Project Sam. Let's build it together. Attached was Keanu's proposal. Plans. Budget. Vision. A request for Greg to co-host a new docuseries that would follow the building of the center and highlight emotional stories of people like Sam, like Ava, like Clara, like the girl in the town hall. But this wasn't about entertainment. It was about legacy. The groundbreaking ceremony. 2 weeks later, in a quiet field just outside Los Angeles, a small wooden stage had been built. No press, no paparazzi. Just about 100 people, volunteers, mental health workers, teenagers, veterans, and survivors. At the center stood a large banner. Project Sam, a place for every broken voice. Keanu stepped up first. He looked around, not at a crowd, but at souls. Thank you for being here, he began. This is the most important role I've ever played. And I don't even need a script. Light laughter, soft and supportive. Sam once told me that if we could hear each other's pain, we'd stop hurting one another. Today we begin listening. Not to fix, not to preach, but just to understand. Then Keanu stepped aside and handed the mic to Greg. Greg took a deep breath. I used to use a mic like this to shame people, he said. But today, I want to use it to honor them. He looked up. I'm sorry to everyone I've ever hurt. And I'm grateful to Keanu for showing me that redemption isn't something you wait for. It's something you build, one brick at a time. The crowd applauded. Then, together, Greg and Keanu planted the first stake in the ground. A new beginning. But then, the storm came. 3 days later, tragedy struck. A fire broke out at a transitional shelter for at-risk teens in East La, a place where Keanu had been secretly volunteering every Sunday for months. The fire was swift, brutal. Electrical fault, they said. One young man died. His name was Liam, 17 years old. He had just been accepted into a scholarship program. Keanu was devastated. He had spoken to Liam the week before, had shared his story, had promised him that the pain would pass. I told him to hold on, Keanu whispered. He sat alone on the floor of his home, surrounded by candles. The grief felt different this time. Not like Sam's, not like Ava's. This was raw, because Keanu had believed they were winning. At all the kindness, the outreach, the stories, they were saving lives. But Liam was gone, and no words could bring him back. Greg shows up. That night, Greg knocked on Keanu's door. When it opened, he didn't say anything. He simply sat beside Keanu on the floor, lit a candle, placed it in front of him. I don't have the right words, Greg said, but I'm not leaving. Keanu nodded silently. 2 men, sitting in grief. No armor, just presence. The letter from Liam's sister. The next morning, Keanu received another letter. It was from Liam's older sister. Dear Keanu, you were his favorite. You gave him hope when nothing else did. He talked about you constantly, said if someone like you could survive loss, maybe he could too. He didn't lose hope. Not really. The fire took him, but not before he left this in his journal. Keanu told me silence isn't weakness, so when I speak, I'll make it count. Thank you for seeing him, and for reminding us that grief doesn't erase impact. Sarah, Keanu called Sarah. He listened to her story. He cried with her. And then he did something no one expected. He asked if she'd help design one of the healing rooms at Project Sam, one dedicated to Liam's memory. She agreed and named it the Room of Second Chances, the ripple that never ends, one final act of grace. The sun rose over Project Sam, not just over a building, but over a living symbol of healing, of second chances, of broken pieces stitched together not by perfection, but by kindness. The last construction nail had been hammered. The murals were complete, the gardens planted, the rooms furnished with softness and hope. Each wing of the center had a name. The Room of Second Chances for Liam, the quiet hall for those who needed silence, the memory room filled with letters, photos, and voice recordings from survivors who once felt unseen. At the heart of it all stood a simple statue in the center courtyard, a bronze tree with thousands of names carved into its trunk and branches. Names of the lost, names of the living, names of those still holding on. The plaque read, "Your story matters, and it always will." Project Sam. Today, it would open its doors for the first time. The opening ceremony. Word had spread, not through advertisements or press releases, but through whispered gratitude, online testimonials, and stories passed from person to person. The world had watched this center rise like a phoenix from the ashes of tragedy, heartbreak, and vulnerability. And so, on opening day, people came. From every walk of life. Celebrities, construction workers, therapists, teenagers, mothers, homeless veterans, former addicts, runaways, grieving fathers, refugee families. A crowd of thousands gathered quietly on the grass under a gentle spring sun. Greg Carson stood at the podium first, dressed in a simple shirt and dark jeans. No cue cards, no teleprompters, just truth. Greg's speech, a final unmasking. "I used to think stories were currency," he began. "That the more pain you could expose, the more powerful you became." He paused. "But I learned that stories aren't weapons, they're bridges. And I spent years burning mine, until someone reminded me that it's never too late to rebuild." He looked to his right, where Keanu sat silently in the front row. "I once tried to humiliate a man who had done nothing but walk gently through a world that never deserved him. But instead of firing back, he handed me a mirror." Greg's voice shook. "I saw who I was, and I chose to change. This center is for all of us who are trying." Tears shimmered in his eyes as the crowd gave him a standing ovation. He stepped down, and Keanu rose. Keanu's speech, the final offering. There was no microphone needed. The field fell into reverent silence as Keanu stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was soft, but carried like wind through trees. "When I was 17, I laughed louder. I dreamed bigger. I believed people were invincible." He looked at the crowd. "Then I lost Sam. I lost my daughter. I lost the woman I loved. And for a long time, I lived, but I wasn't alive." A breeze moved through the grass. "I found purpose in small acts. Buying a sandwich for someone, sitting beside a grieving stranger, rescuing a dog, listening more than I spoke." He took a long breath. "And then I told the world about Sam, and I met Liam. And I lost him too. But his sister reminded me, grief doesn't erase impact. It echoes." Keanu turned, pointing toward the bronze tree. "This place, you, are those echoes." Then he smiled. "And may they never stop." The reunion. A stranger among the crowd. After the speeches, people flooded the grounds, touring rooms, participating in workshops, leaving handwritten notes on the wall of voices. Keanu had stepped aside to catch his breath when an older man approached him slowly, supported by a cane. He wore a faded army jacket and had deep, weary eyes. "Keanu?" he asked softly. "Yes." The man removed a small photograph from his pocket, cracked at the edges, yellowed with time. It was Keanu and Sam, sitting on a bench in Portland, arms slung over each other, smiling wide. "I'm Sam's father," the man said. Keanu's breath hitched. "I thought you hated me," he whispered. "I did." The old man nodded. "For a long time, I blamed you for everything. For leaving. For rising while Sam fell. But then I watched that interview. And I realized you never left him. He just didn't know how to ask you to stay." Keanu's throat tightened. The man reached out and gripped Keanu's hand. "Thank you for keeping my boy alive in this world." They held each other, not as strangers, not as enemies, but as two men carrying the same weight and letting go together. One child, one drawing, one spark. In the afternoon, a small boy, no older than 10, approached Keanu with a crumpled paper in his hands. "Mr. Reeves," he said shyly, "this is for you." Keanu knelt. The boy handed him a drawing. Crayon on torn notebook paper, it showed a giant tree surrounded by people. One man stood beneath it with a dog at his side and a heart in his hand. Above the tree, in childlike lettering, were the words, "Be kind, because you might be the only one who is." "Liam." Keanu blinked in shock. "How did you know Liam?" The boy shook his head. "I didn't, but my sister told me his story." "Who's your sister?" He pointed. Standing in the crowd was Sarah, Liam's sister. Keanu looked back at the boy. "Do you like to draw?" "I want to make books," he said proudly, "with pictures that make people feel okay." Keanu smiled. "Then promise me something. Someday, when you're ready, make a book with this drawing in it. I'll help you publish it." The boy beamed. "You mean it?" Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "I've never meant anything more." The global ripple begins. Within a week, news of the center and that drawing spread across the internet. The child's artwork went viral. Major publishers offered to turn the picture into a children's book about empathy. The boy's story was picked up by schools and teachers around the world. Children began creating their own kindness trees in classrooms across continents. Art galleries launched exhibitions titled Echoes of Sam, featuring works inspired by grief and healing. Therapists began incorporating clips from Keanu's speech into group therapy. A single boy's crayon drawing had sparked a global movement. And Keanu, he simply watched, not from a red carpet, but from the back of the room, smiling. One more subway ride. 1 month later, Keanu boarded a subway late at night, just as he always had. He wore no disguise, no security, just a hoodie and headphones. Across from him sat a young woman, quietly crying into her sleeve. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a note, folded it twice and gently slid it across the bench. She opened it. "You are seen. You are strong. And this pain, it will not define you. A friend who's been there." She looked up in disbelief. Keanu smiled, nodded once, and stepped off at the next stop. Epilogue. One last letter. To anyone reading this, this story isn't about me. It never was. It's about how pain doesn't get the final word, how silence can become song, how a single act of compassion can ripple through generations. Sam taught me that. Liam reminded me of it. And maybe now, you'll carry it forward. With love, Keanu.